So what's a science writer like me doing writing a book about the L? Well, basically it's because I'm an L writer. I've been taking the L every day, almost, to work or to shop or whatever, for a good 25 years now. And I was always interested in what's to see outside the windows and what's going on in the cars. I just find it so fascinating. So then one day I read that the Chicago History Museum was starting a new program to give tours of the L. So I signed up for that, and then in doing the research, I discovered there's no popular book about the L. There are a couple that are technical. There's a great one by Bruce Moffett. It only goes up to 1932. So, you know, I'm a writer. I said, oh, there's no book. There must be a niche here. I'll just write it. Well, it took 4 years to pull together the research and to know enough about the subject to put a book out. So that's kind of how that happened. But I would say to all of you, if any of you think you might have a book in you, do not hold back. Write the book. It's been so much fun. It's been so exciting. Going into it, I thought books are dead. You know, people don't read anymore. Everybody's on the internet. And I almost didn't get started. And so, in fact, just the opposite's true. People are reading books, loving books. There's book clubs. There's all kinds of wonderful things surrounding books. And here's evidence of it tonight. I'll give you one little example of the kind of fun I've had since becoming an author. And this is the kind of thing that I'm sure happens to every author. So again, if you have a book in you, don't hold back. So here's what happened to me. I usually take the L everywhere I go, but once I became an author, I sometimes had to take boxes of books, you know, to bookstores or whatever. So I borrowed my daughter's car one day, loaded it up with some books, and I'm driving over to the Borders or whatever, and I get rear-ended at a red light. And I'm pretty strict with my daughter, so you know, she would have really laid into me if I had damaged or been involved in any damage to her car. So I was really, really worried. So I get out of the car, I have my sunglasses on, I take the camera out of the glove compartment, you know, to take a picture of the accident, and I go in the back, and there's really hardly any damage. Meanwhile, a young lady jumps out of the car and is very apologetic. It was my fault, I'm so sorry, you know. So I decided, no big deal, let it go. But I didn't want to let her off scot-free. I wanted to teach her a lesson, right? So I said, ma'am, you can leave. No hard feelings, but there's one condition. You have to buy 2 copies of my book. Isn't that awful? And she was not excited about that. So her first question kind of surprised me, though. But maybe you all will understand it because you're book lovers. She asked me, well, is it fiction or nonfiction? Luckily, it was nonfiction, which she liked, so she pulls her checkbook out, and all right, what's your book about? I say, it's about the L. Then she lightens up. Oh, that's cool. My husband loves the L. You know, this will make a good present for him. Could you inscribe a copy to him? And I say, well, what's his name? And she says, Jeffrey Bear. Now, he's a local superstar on Channel 11, has done many videos about the history of Chicago and stuff like that. And so she starts to say, well, you know, it's Jeffrey, is G-E-O, it's a, you know, funny spelling. So I say to her, if you open the book to page 6, you'll see I know how to spell his name because he's thanked in the acknowledgments, and he's a good friend of mine. So, you know, I'm glad to meet you. And we parted as friends. I threw in 2 extra books because I felt really bad. And then by the time I get to work, there's a phone message from Jeffrey himself saying, what's the big idea? Extortion, you know, picking on my wife and all this stuff. So you know, it's just been nonstop like that. Here's a copy of the check. So you can see I didn't make up the story, all right? Well, let's get down to business here. What are we going to talk about tonight? Maybe we could dim the lights. Oh, Christine, you're right on target. Thank you. We're going to talk about why we should even care about the L, you know, that 19th century technology, dirty, clunky, old, dirty, noisy, everything else. Why should we care? Then we'll also talk a little bit about mass transit in Chicago before the L came along. Now, if we had 3 or 4 hours, I'd love to do a whole history of the L. But the book does that pretty much. So, you know, I'm trying to do something different. Most of the slides you'll see tonight are not in the book. I want to give you something a little different than you might get on your own with the book somewhere else. So the period of mass transit in Chicago before the L came along is a pretty colorful period. So we'll touch on that. And then we'll finish up with just a few fun, surprising things that you might or might not know about the L. The main reason to start with that we should care about the L is because it's part of our history. You have to know your history to know where you're coming from and where you're going. This is car number 1, speaking of history. This is the very first car that was ever used on the L. The first line ran from Congress south to 39th Street. Started running 1892. Eventually that line was extended to the World's Fair at Jackson Park. So that was the reason we got an L in part was to prepare for the World's Fair of 1893. So think about this for a second. Car number 1. It was pretty much forgotten, shoved aside in a barn at the CTA for a while. Once in a while, it was taken out on the tracks for a special event, a VIP trip or something like that. But then it was really, really getting run down. Well, ultimately, all the other cars of this vintage have been lost. And the CTA realized how precious this is, and they donated it to the Chicago History Museum. And since then, this car has been lovingly restored. You can see it in all its beauty at the History Museum. It has ventilator windows up here on the top that are stained glass. It's got etched windows all around, beautiful etched glass, gold trim on the outside. Inside, it's mahogany wood. Beautiful car. And you can go and sit in it and walk in it and get a feel for what it might have been like to take that car down to the World's Fair. Would have cost you a nickel. This is the oldest mass transit station in, now you're thinking I'm going to say Chicago, in the United States of America. It was part of that first line in 1892. And you can see they were street level back then, and the stations were quite small, kind of cute, actually. They were all torn down except this one. It survives by chance. It was used as a mass transit station, as an L station, up till the year 2000. And then the CTA built a brand new station across the street. Yes, this lady's surprised. Until 2000, partly because ridership on this line was so low. This is what's now the Green Line today. Pretty minimal ridership over the last several decades, so nobody bothered with it. They left it alone. And today it's boarded up. I hope they turn it into a museum or something, because it's really a wonderful piece of our history.
What was the Green Line known as when we were young?
Well, when you were young, it was the Jackson Park, Englewood line. And this shows you a little bit what that station looked like, you know, on a busy day in the 40s or 50s, just to give you a sense of what it might have looked like. I didn't want to leave you with the impression of the previous slide where this station's all abandoned. Now, how many of you are from Chicago? Oh, wow. I was born in Chicago, too. And I'm expecting that since so many of you are from Chicago, you'll be able to tell me where this picture was taken.
Yeah.
How about if I tell you the date, 1907? Does that help any? You weren't around then. Believe it or not, this is Lawrence and Western. And we're looking west, and these workers are clearing the land for the L tracks of the Ravenswood line. And so this shows you that the L helped to develop the city and the suburbs. It helped to break ground, literally speaking. Here we're going through fields and farms and prairies. Another reason to care about the L is because it's a cultural icon. It says you're in Chicago better than just about anything I can think of. And that's one reason so many movies use the L as a locating shot. Even just sometimes the sound of the L, that rumbling, characteristic sound, will identify the location as Chicago in movies. And this is, of course, a beautiful shot looking east on the Lake Street L at the south branch of the Chicago River. Another reason to care about the L is it's unique. There's no other city in the world that has an L that defines its city center, that actually crisscrosses its downtown and defines the city. Other cities have L's, of course. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Paris. But in every other case, the L is an extension of a subway line, and it comes above ground on the outskirts of the downtown area, or else it's elevated entirely outside of the downtown area. So we have something very special in Chicago. It is noisy, but it's something that a lot of Chicagoans are kind of proud of too, because it is unique. Another reason, the L is democratic and egalitarian. Now, this is kind of a feel-good shot to represent those ideals, but the ideals are very important if you think about it for a minute. The L is an equalizer. Everybody rides together. You can ride the L and hear different languages, different ages of people, different cultural backgrounds. Some of you now are riding for free, so everybody's not paying the same fare, but otherwise it's pretty much an equalizer. There was never any have to sit in the back of the bus, or segregation or prejudice on the L. Also, the L is very attractive. Now, maybe that's just me. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? But I find it stunningly attractive. Some of these scenes that you see the L from afar or up close can be very, very beautiful. Here we see that same Lake Street L that we saw just a few minutes ago. Now we're looking at it from the other direction, the Merchandise Mart, looking south at the south branch of the Chicago River. It's even more beautiful in color. Here's the CTA's newest line, the pink line, right? Well, some people weren't too fond of that color when it was announced, but it really is quite beautiful. Raspberry. But it reflects the beauty of the Fisher Building here, which is kind of pinkish salmon colored, and it complements beautifully the green train shed here at the Harold Washington Library Station in the Loop. And that shed was built to emulate the train sheds in Paris, to resemble that style. And so it does make a very beautiful package, I think. Also, the style, the streamlining, the 50-ish look of many of the CTA stations and signs, I think is quite attractive. It harkens back to another day. Now, I have a friend I mentioned to that I was doing a book about the L, and she says, "Oh, my husband paints L stations." And I said, "Does he work for the CTA?" No, he's an artist, and he sees so much beauty in the L that he specializes in paintings of L stations. Michael Nevin. So here's one of his paintings. This is the Holman or the Ashland station, I'm not sure, before they moved the stairs off the street into the sidewalks. But it's that style of station that was so beautiful on the Lake Street line. There's still two of them now, Ashland and Central. You can go look at those two stations. They've been beautifully restored. But this painting does a nice job of preserving that beauty. Another fellow I know paints L station and L scenes. And here you can look at this and see how it really evokes a gritty kind of urban scene. It's really wonderful with the L front and center. Now, I think that the nuts and bolts of the L are beautiful too, not just the sunsets on the pink line and all this other stuff. I'm really nuts about it. Can anyone identify where this picture was taken? Well, it's not really fair. I cheated a bit because it's the Eiffel Tower. Now, why would I throw a picture of the Eiffel Tower in here? Well, that's because it was built for another World's Fair, the one in Paris, 1889, and it perfected a construction technology that was used to build the L, starting a couple years later. That construction technology is called riveted plate steel. And it's basically just a giant erector set, in this case, up to the sky. And when they built the Eiffel Tower, it was a huge event around the world that they could build something so tall and then it would stand. So if people see beauty in the Eiffel Tower, why not in the L structure, the nuts and bolts of the L also? Another kind of beauty is the architecture that you can see from the L. And Chicago, of course, has some of the most important and beautiful world-class architecture found anywhere. So by riding on the L, you can see some of these beautiful buildings in a different way. They look different than street level. You see things that you don't see from the ground. This is at about Chinatown, looking north to the Loop. Here's an example of this kinds of things that you can pick up from riding the L. If you look out the window and you're curious, you'll see things, and you'll say, oh, what is that? And you'll get into it more and more, the history of our city and the architecture that surrounds us that we often take for granted. Here we're back at the Harold Washington Library Station. You can tell from the owls overhead. And one day, you know, I spotted this kind of interesting looking building here. What is that, you know? And it turns out it's pretty important. It's the Old Colony building. And it was once the tallest building in Chicago. It's down on Van Buren Street. Here's another old building, the Washington Block building. Built, I forget, about 1889, 90, something like that, before the L came in. And you notice that there's two very old buildings I just showed you, and they're both right along the L. Well, I maintain that the L is responsible for the very existence, for the continued existence of Chicago's oldest buildings. And that's because the fire of 1871 leveled the downtown. Then, right away, people started building new buildings. And some of them, over the years, were skyscrapers and very important, beautiful, interesting buildings. Well, then, in about 1897, the Loop was built. That's an interesting aside. The first line, 1892, I said before it went south. 3 other lines were planned or built, and they were all kept out of the city center. The Loop L itself was pretty much an afterthought to connect the 4 existing lines. So you get the Loop L built, and it takes the course that it wants, and it happens to run next to certain buildings. Well, then over the next 50, 100 years, these buildings are left alone because corporate America, building their banks and their office towers, they don't want to be right by the L because it's noisy and dirty, right? And so they leave these buildings alone. And then in the 60s and 70s, we finally start to protect our historic buildings. We stop tearing them down and we protect them. So they survive long enough to be protected so that now they're protected. And if it hadn't been for the L, if it hadn't been for the proximity of the L, they would have been torn down long ago. Here's an example of what's going on now. Now the previous slide was Washington and Wells. Now we're on the other side of the Loop, over at Wabash. And there's a whole bunch of old buildings along Wabash that have been left alone. Some of them are boarded up even. People didn't want to live or have a shop near the L. But now they don't mind, because a block away to the east is Millennium Park. And so now this land is extremely valuable, and developers are trying to tear down these old buildings. And in many cases they can't, because the buildings are protected. In some cases, they're only partly protected, and that's what we have going on here. This scaffolding is holding up the facade of a building right behind it. And this is an important building for whatever reasons, architecture, history, or culture. So the developer was allowed to tear the building down, but they had to preserve the front. I call it a facade-ectomy, all right? It's not great, but it's better than nothing. The result of this approach is this. This is Heritage, I think, a big condo at Randolph and Michigan. Heritage Tower, I think it's called. And on the Wabash side, and I took this picture from the L platform, on the Wabash side you see 3 facades that have been protected. Beautiful old buildings, Italianate, or I'm not an architect. I don't know why they're so important. But only the facades have been protected, and right behind these windows are parking spots for the condominium tower that fronts on Michigan Avenue. Remarkable. Another reason we should care about the L is it's so fuel efficient. One train can keep something like 800 cars off the road. And that has to mean a lot in these days about concerns of global warming, pollution, and the high cost of gas. And L ridership, by the way, is booming now with the current economic and political situation. So people are realizing that. It's also a bargain. I don't care what they say about the fare. They can raise it if they want. It's still a bargain. If you think about it, you can ride 25, 40, 50 miles for $2. And a lot of people agree with me. 500,000 people take the L every day during a workday. They don't use tokens anymore, though. Perhaps the most important reason we need to care about the L is because it's endangered. Despite all the wonderful things we just said and hopefully agreed upon, the L's endangered. It could be torn down. Pieces of it could be torn down at any time if there was a shift in political will or priorities or funding issues. You all remember the doomsday scenario we went through about a year and a half ago, and there was no state budget, and what are we going to do? And so the CTA, RTA as well, took a big hit. Well, the first doomsday scenario from the CTA was to close 2 of our 8 L lines. The yellow line and the purple line would have been closed down. And believe me, once they're closed, it's pretty hard to get them back. Throughout the system, there's 8 miles of this traditional L steel structure that have been torn down. And many, many more miles have been abandoned, miles at ground level, or route miles that were shared with the interurbans. Many more than the 8 were abandoned or torn down over the years. Here's a map from the book, and we'll zoom in so you can get a sense of how much we've lost. If you look at the X's, that's where branches, lines, structure, and routes have been lost. The picture we just saw was the Humboldt Park line, ran pretty much parallel to North Avenue. And I bet you they wish they had that back. This little piece, too, running on Marshfield, Paulina, north-south, I bet they wish they had that back now, because there's been talk of building a circle line, which would connect red, blue, green, brown. And this would have been a good route for a circle line if they'd still had it. Or you could have run your circle line through here in a tighter circle if we still had some of those pieces. You have a question?
That one piece,
This piece? This piece.
there, right there.
Yes.
Isn't that where the bridge to nowhere is?
Yes. Yes, there's a bridge there that used to be part of this line, and the line has been torn down, which is what those Alexas mean. But they never bothered to tear the bridge down because it's massive, okay? A lot of scrap metal in that bridge, but it's massive, and it also serves a function for the metro trains. They have all their signals lined up on that bridge, so they've left it there. So if you ever want to go look at it, yes?
And there are two lines going up, the Humboldt Park line and the
This.
Logan Square line,
Yes,
on the, like, the near northwest side.
yes,
Marshfield Avenue Station was like the transfer point
Yes.
of the Garfield Park down to the
that's
other
right.
side.
That was a hub right here at Marshfield. Was a hub for the old Metropolitan West Side line.
The Garfield Park line is now one of the lines that runs down the Eisenhower Expressway.
That's right, right, which serves commuters more than local residents of the neighborhood. So I maintain that they've lost ridership by converting that from an elevated structure to an L that runs down the median strip of a superhighway. That's this line right here we're talking about. Okay, I just, want to emphasize that transit's always in trouble. It's always underfunded. It's always under attack. We need to support it. It's good for everybody. And if we want to get the Olympics, we need a better transportation system. A recent report from the Olympic Committee gave Chicago some low grades, some low marks for its transportation infrastructure. And I like to remind you that we got the L in the first place because of a world event, the World's Fair of 1893, the Columbian Exposition. And I think that if we want to get the Olympics, we need to beef up our L and entire transportation infrastructure. All right, let's move on. Take a quick look at mass transit in Chicago before the L came along. Of course, the city was incorporated 1837. It was a small frontier town at that time. 350 people lived in the city, and people could walk to work or church or to visit their neighbors. But the city grew very fast, and distances became just too great. Now, these were the horse and buggy days, but only the wealthy had horse and buggies. There were no automobiles, so people clamored for some kind of mass transportation. It wasn't just kind of an add-on. It was the nuts and bolts of the circulation of people in the city. And Chicagoans saw that other cities had subways and elevated trains, and so they wanted mass transit too. So finally, 1853, Chicago gets its first form of mass transit, and that was the omnibus, which you can see here. They're basically glorified stagecoaches that had been run out of business by the growing intercity railroads were building up in the early 50s. So we got some extra stagecoaches. Let's put them to work in cities, and they would generally run between hotels and train stations. Here you see the omnibuses in front of the Chicago Northwestern train station. And this is now where the Merchandise Mart stands, in case you want to situate yourself a little bit. They were open to anyone, though. They weren't just hotel shuttles or something. Anybody could get on, pay a fare. Next up, 1859, are horse-drawn rail cars. A big improvement over the omnibus because the ride is smooth and faster. But it still relies on the horse. Not a very good source of power for mass transit. Horses could only work maybe 4 hours a day, and they have to be switched out. They were expensive to feed and groom. Sometimes if they died, operators might leave them along the side of the road. They created a terrible health hazard. Plus, what they left behind in the street was unpleasant and a health hazard as well. So the entrepreneurs of the day started looking for mechanical power to replace the horses. And I want to emphasize that the L was built by private enterprise. City and state granted franchises and set rules for the lines, but it was built, the whole system was built by private enterprise. Initially, 4 independent L lines were built, and that created the skeleton upon which everything else was added. And those 4 lines were built between 1892 and 1900 by some very rugged entrepreneurs. And one of them was Charles Tyson Yerkes. If you want a colorful story, read one of his biographies, or Theodore Dreiser did a great book about Yerkes. Yerkes came from Philadelphia, where he had served time, came to Chicago. Guess he fit right in here. He quickly started buying up these horse-drawn rail lines, primarily using other people's money. He was a great financier. He would float bonds, get other people's money, and pay himself dividends. You know, he had it all worked out. But he was a visionary. He was a robber baron, but a visionary, because he's the one who pushed things forward. And forward is, next up, brings you to cable cars. Now, by that I mean the very same type of cable cars that are still operating in San Francisco. Many people don't realize that Chicago had cable cars. Not only did we have cable cars, we had the largest system in the country in terms of equipment. Almost 1,500 pieces of equipment, 86 miles of cable car tracks, and 11 power stations. So these, of course, are powered by latching on to a cable which is moving under the street in a continuous loop. And the operator would use the grip to pull down and latch onto that cable, and it would propel the car forward. And when he was ready to stop, he'd let go of that cable and then put the brakes on. Great system, very expensive to build, very expensive to maintain, especially with the winters we have in Chicago. Here's another cable car picture. I just think it's so wonderful to dig back and learn about some of these surprises in our history. You could tell it's a cable car because there's 3 grooves here. The outside 2 for the wheels, and the inside groove is where that grip would go underneath and grab the moving cable that was constantly moving underground. I shouldn't say constantly. They had to be shut down at night for inspection so that all the frays would be repaired. So not a good system for a city like Chicago, which was so vibrant, because it shut down every night. Later the L comes along, it would run continuously, 24/7. Think about that. The L's been running 116 years, 24/7. Not bad. In case you're curious, we are looking north on LaSalle, and this way would be east on Randolph. So this car is turning to go north. It's going to go into this tunnel, and the tunnel went under the Chicago River and came up on the other side. And you can still see the structure of this tunnel on LaSalle Avenue on the north side of the river if you want to just go and look at it for fun. Incredible to think we had cable cars running under our river at this point. We had 3 tunnels like this, in fact. Next up is trolleys, another huge advancement, because trolleys are pulling electrical power from wires overhead. These could run all night. And they're faster, more quiet, and they could provide heat and electricity inside the car, so much more comfortable. Really a big, big improvement. This is one of the very first trolleys that ever operated, and it actually has an engine in front, hidden to look, disguised to look like a passenger car. Because at this point, 1890, electricity was a very new thing. And horses and passengers were afraid of electricity. So they didn't want to make it look too scary. Later, the trolley cars, of course, had the motors within, underneath the carriage of the car. Didn't need an engine pulling them. But look how long the trolleys lasted, all the way up to 58, 57, 58. So finally, all this is going on in the city, and I've only shown you a portion of the experimentation that was going on in transit. We also had transit systems that were powered by compressed air. We had battery-powered cars. Talk about ahead of your time. Now we're going towards batteries for motive power. And there were other types of systems being experimented with. And into the mix then finally comes the L. No, that's an old train out in the Rocky Mountains. That's the L, all right? But it's a pretty surprising picture too, because look what's pulling it. A steam locomotive. The first 2 lines were pulled by steam locomotives. Imagine the smoke, the sparks, the boiling water dripping off the locomotive, hitting the passengers below. Here we see one of those ground level stations of the very first line going to the World's Fair. And this shows you the locomotive from the other direction, just to show you that these were pretty big engines, pretty powerful, pretty loud, pretty heavy. And people always ask me, is the L safe? Well, it was overbuilt. Railroads are typically overbuilt, but most of the initial lines were built to carry the weight of locomotives. So, you know, they were really overbuilt, partly for that reason. But let's look at the World's Fair, 1893. Not only did it provide a catalyst for that very first line to be built, but it also provided a model that we still use today. And that's because at the World's Fair there was an elevated train. It was called the intramural. And it was kind of like a people mover, kind of like a ride. You know, cost 10 cents a ride, very expensive, very popular rides. Over 6 million people rode this. No accidents, no problems with operations or equipment. And this little line ran about 3 miles along the edge of the fair, hitting some of the major important buildings. And on each end, it had a turning loop that looked like this. Pretty big structure. You can see all the cars are open because the fair was only intended to continue during the summer and fall. So cars were open for the fresh air. Here's another picture of one of the turning loops. But the reason I'm going on and on about this is because this train pioneered something for the first time anywhere in the world. It pioneered the use of a trackside third rail electric power system. And it worked so well that all the other L lines adopted it as they were being built. The ones that had already been built that were using steam converted to the third rail electrical system that we still use to this day. Now, of course, there have been modifications and improvements, but basically we still have the very same technology that was pioneered at this World's Fair. So, school kids learn about the World's Fair and all the important things that came out of it. You know, Aunt Jemima, the pressed penny. The picture postcard was supposedly sent for the first time ever from the World's Fair. Cracker Jacks were sold there for the first time ever. And what's the big one that I haven't listed here, the big innovation that came out of the fair? The Ferris wheel. Well, I would maintain that the L is far more important than all of those other innovations, and so we should add that to our list. Quickly, I want to address the question of why is the L elevated? 2 reasons: congestion and safety. 1880s and 90s, Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world. Skyscrapers are going up. The city center is confined by the lake and to a certain extent the river on the north and west side and the railroad yards on the south side. So you get this funneling effect. Everybody's pouring into the loop to go to work, to shop, to go to cultural opportunities, events. And so the congestion just gets worse and worse. You've got all those types of transit I mentioned that are competing with each other. Trolleys, horse-drawn rail cars, omnibuses. And then you have farmers' wagons delivering goods. You have bicycles, pedestrians, etc. Everyone competing for space. This shows you how bad it could get. It's pretty rare that people would resort to this. Women hanging off the end, and men on the top of the trolley cars, extremely dangerous. You got, whatever, 600 volts of power coming down this little trolley pole. So the city knew it either had to build above the street level or below the street level to get around this terrible congestion. Building below ground, way more expensive, 5 to 10 times as expensive as building an elevated system. So they went with an L. That's how one reason we got an elevated train. Another reason is for safety. All right, so it's a funny picture, I know, to put up to talk about safety. But in fact, most accidents on the L are quite picturesque and often do not lead to serious injury. Now, of course, there have been a handful of serious accidents and fatalities on the L. Very regrettable, but very limited. More than 10 billion people have ridden the L with a minuscule number of accidents and problems, injuries. First accident in the L's history, I have a picture of it in my book, and it's similar to this. There's a train that went right off the end of the line and landed on the street. Well, 2 people were on the train, nobody was hurt, makes a great picture. So, the L is actually very safe. And also, at this time, the time they were planning the L, the city of Chicago was a railroad town. Big, big time. Railroads went everywhere, from mainline, freight, passenger, to trolleys, to other types of rail, horse-drawn rail cars, etc. And there were so many grade crossings that it was extremely dangerous. In Devil in the White City, Eric Larson talks about Chicago in 1893, paints a very vivid picture. And there are over 1,400 at-grade railroad crossings. And that year alone, over 100 people died in railroad accidents. Most of them were kids playing on the tracks that didn't hear the train coming. So the city and the state required these mainline railroad companies to elevate their lines. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And then also, as they granted franchises to the new mass transit system, they required it to be elevated for safety purposes. All right, let's kind of wrap up a little bit with a couple of fun or surprising things. This is what the Lake Street L was supposed to look like. I told you there were a lot of competing systems of mass transit. But this would have been great if they'd ever installed it. Streamlined cars. It's a monorail, so you have less shadowing and darkness on the street. The operator is above for additional safety, have a better view from up there. Pretty cool system. The builders of the Lake Street line contracted with this company to build this. They licensed this system for the Lake Street line, and they were ready to do it. Now, this is just an artist's conception, right? Not too serious. Well, how about the actual train? This is this very train running on a test track in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the company was located. Great system, would have been wonderful. Ultimately, it proved to be too expensive, so the builders of the Lake Street line went with traditional railroad technology, which we've already seen, was steam locomotives. Too bad. All right, there were newspaper trains, all kinds of different things being carried on the L. 1880s and 90s, there were no roads of any consequence out in the outskirts of the city where the cemeteries were located. So a funeral would have to go through the dust or the mud to get out to a funeral and be very unpleasant. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the next slide. In this case, we're talking about the newspaper trains, and again, the roads were terrible. So the fastest way to get the newspapers out to the suburbs was on the L system. Happens to be an interurban car, but running on L tracks, and several times a day, these cars would whisk the news out to the city and suburbs. Before the internet, this was like the best way to get the news and the quickest way to disseminate it. Freight service, also very important on the L. We had freight trains from 1920 all the way up to 1973. And here we see the train operating on the very last day of freight service on the L. This is on what's now the Red Line, the Howard Line. We're at about Bryn Mawr, Berwyn, right in there, 52, 53, 5400 north, looking south, and there's a siding that goes down to a coal company, the Leal Coal Company, which used to be located where there's now a Dominic's or a Jewel right there with a big parking lot. So lots of different kinds of freight were carried: coal, lumber, paper. At the height of the service, 300 tons of coal a night were transported around the L system in freight trains. Pretty remarkable. Now we get to the funeral cars that I started talking about a minute ago. Funeral service ran from 1906 to 1934. And in 06, again, not many cars, and maybe a handful of cars in the whole city. The best way to get to a funeral would be on the smooth, fast L tracks. And here we see a funeral car, dedicated funeral car. Casket would be put into the car through this door with the stained glass windows. The car could hold 2 caskets. The mourners would sit in the back, a beautiful car, well upholstered, and then they could add, of course, other cars to this and make up a whole train of cars to take hundreds of people to the funeral. There were also some stations that had casket elevators, so you could start your funeral at a number of different locations on the system, depending on where you lived. We have to talk just a second about the subway, because it's so important to the L system. Even though you're underground, we still think of the subway as part of our L. We might never have gotten a subway, except for the Depression, because there was all kinds of talk about a subway. And we already mentioned that we went with an L instead because it was more affordable. But finally, with the Depression, we had a huge, inexpensive force of workers to build the subway in an affordable fashion. So it started to be built in 1938, and it was opened, the very first line, the State Street line, in 1943, during the war. Here you see a construction site for the subway. They're working underground here. And I just wanted to show you PWA. It was a Public Works Administration project. Building the subway was very difficult because of the mud and the high water table in the Chicago area. So here you see people, workers, inside of a pressurized kind of canister where they were literally cutting the mud off of the sides and carrying it and pushing this into the future tunnel for the subway. Very tough work. One of the most picturesque, colorful, and odoriferous L lines certainly was the Stockyard branch. Here you see the train operating right over all of the pens, and it was a very serious, well-patronized line, basically to carry workers to their jobs. The stops on this line were Armour, Swift, Packing House, you know. Now, yes, it was mainly for the workers, but that didn't stop the tourists from riding this line too, to take a look at the amazing sight of all these pens full of animals. And then they could get off and get a tour of the packing house. How many of you ever rode this line? Very few people. I wish I had. It must have been wonderful, especially in the summer, right? With all the windows open. So the tourists would come out and get a very incredible sight from the train, and then tour the packing houses and finish off their day with a nice steak dinner. And I've been told even that school kids were taken out to tour the packing houses as well on L trains. Now, I don't think the school kids got the steak dinner, but imagine sixth graders, you know, going out and seeing the slaughterhouses. Incredible. But just to point out that, yes, it really was a tourist attraction. Here's a postcard I found at the Printers Row Book Fair. And here you have, you know, Art Institute. And here you have another great Chicago cultural institution, the Stockyards. Side by side right there. You know, wish you were here. Having a good time in Chicago. Yes, you had a quick question? Right.
Which was like a small version of Chicago Stadium. The Bulls played their first basketball season out there. How did you know that?
It was a great line. Yeah. This is a story about Chicago's oldest house, the Clark House. There it is right there. Hard to believe if any of you have seen it recently. This house was built in 1836. On the edge of the city, Michigan and 18th Street, okay? And as the city grew, the people who owned the house, they wanted to get away from the city, so they picked it up and moved it way out into the distant suburbs of the time to 44th Street. Well, within a couple of years, it got swallowed up again as the city rolled out to the south. So they gave up on the house, abandoned it. It fell into disrepair. It was used as a church, and it was used as a community center of some kind. Well, finally, in the 70s, we talked about how the city began to appreciate its history a little more. So the city of Chicago decided to acquire this house and move it back to near its original location. So here we see that work going on, and take note, it's December 4th of 1977. And so the reason it was difficult to move it back to its original location is because the Green Line had been built, the Englewood-Jackson Park L line had been built in the way of moving it back. So the house had to be lifted over the tracks to get it back to 18th and Michigan. So it was on this side, was lifted up, it was rolled across the tracks in the middle of the night, and then we saw it was December, right? It was a dark and stormy night. The equipment froze. This was hydraulic lift equipment, and it froze. So this house stood up there for 2 or 3 days. Can you imagine going to work one morning and it's like, oh man, where did that house come from? But you should go see it now. It's on Prairie Avenue in the Prairie Avenue Historic District. Been beautifully restored. You'd hardly recognize the fact that it has survived 2 fires and 2 moves. 3 moves by this time. So go check it out, right by the Glesner House, which is also worth seeing. I threw this in just to make a point that the L has always been underappreciated, underfunded. Here we see an L station. I think it's on the Ravenswood line. And what do we have here? Heat provided by a pot-belly stove burning coal. This is how many stations were heated up until the 70s. All right, so L has not been lavished in resources over its history, believe me. I think we should lavish the L and celebrate it and appreciate it more. And one way to do that is to use it for special events. You can charter an L train for a party. You can get married on the L. In this case, we have a fashion show. Just a couple years ago, and they took over this train on the Ravenswood line, and it was running up and down the line during the fashion show, and the models were going up and down the aisles and changing in their outfits in the car next door to it. And they even changed the advertisements up ahead to match the theme of the fashion show. But there's also a way to celebrate the L outside of the cars. Here we see a couple of very ambitious workers climbing the corporate ladder on the side of this building. These are mannequins that are put there as advertisements to attract the eye, the attention of people riding by in the L. This is on Franklin at about Erie, right around in there, near North. So it's fun to look out the window and see all the incredible things there are to see. And this is a photo of a couple of workers who maintained a beautiful little nature preserve at the end of the Ravenswood line. For years and years, they had birdhouses, a duck pond, a barbecue pit, fruit-bearing trees, flowers. They'd have picnics for school kids out there and things like that. So, you know, why not? Why not? Speaking of things you see out the window, there's a famous bike store in Chicago, and it's a little kind of a urban kind of story because this bike lights up at night every time an L train goes by. Okay? It has a little motion detector, and then these lights, they go on. So some people ride the L sometimes just to see it, and they show it to kids and stuff like that, you know, like Buckingham Fountain or something. And so I wanted to get a picture of this in my book. So I get permission, I actually got permission from the owner to get up on the roof, and the bike is pretty high, so I was on the top of a ladder shooting pictures, and every time I heard a train approaching, I'd get ready, get my focus, and then I'd shoot the picture when the train was nicely placed behind the bike. And after a while, I get pretty tired of that, kind of cold, and I said, the heck with it, I got enough pictures here. So then I hear one more train coming and say, all right, one more, and look what came by. Our famous Santa train, which the CTA tried to cancel a couple years ago to save money, and the public outcry was so loud that they quickly reinstated it. This Santa train is a lot of fun. Every December, it circulates all around the system. Throws candy out to kids. The employees are singing Christmas carols in the cars. It's very, very festive. And I'm just so fortunate to be there to snap that picture when it was going by. Because the system's so big, the Santa train only goes by every point in the system, maybe 2 or 3 times during the whole month of December. So great that I was there right at that moment. Well, thank you so much for coming, and I'm up front if anyone has any additional questions.